Hi, my name is Javier Albornoz. Today we're going to be talking about dynamics processing in Pro Tools. Some of the things we'll discuss are using compressors, expanders, and limiters, how they're used to control the dynamic range of an audio signal, control peaks in an audio signal, and bring up softer sounds. So some of the concepts we'll talk about are using the threshold, ratio, makeup gain, attack, and release. Now, when we're talking about compression, dynamics compression, it has nothing to do with, say, file compression like an MP3 versus a WAV file, where an MP3 can be on the average of 10 times smaller of a file than a full bandwidth WAV file. So this is a different type of compression where what we're doing are actually controlling the dynamics or the different variations in volume of an audio signal so that we can, as what's commonly done, is control peaks in the audio or bring up sounds that are softer and should be a little bit louder while we're controlling peaks. So let's look at this compressor that I've pulled up here, and this is called the C1 compressor, and it's a good way to be able to visualize what you're doing when you're applying compression to an audio signal. So as you can see here, we have the mentioned controls, threshold, ratio, makeup gain, and here's the attack and the release, which would be some of the most important controls on a compressor, limiter, or expander. So when you look over here at this graph, what you're going to see is how much compression you're applying to the audio. And essentially what you've got is a curve showing you the in versus the output after the audio has been compressed. So let's go through some of these controls. Now, threshold, as you can see here, can also be controlled in this fader that I'm moving right here. And you can see that it's also moving this fader down here, and you'll see why later. So our threshold is measured in decibels, and essentially when you're here at 0 or unity 0 decibels, essentially any audio that exceeds that level is where we're going to begin to apply compression. So usually up there is sort of a default before any compression is happening kind of setting, because any audio that is going up that loud is most likely going to be distorted and really beyond a level that we want to be working with. So let's see what level our narration here we're getting to so that we can determine at what, more or less, what area we want to work with when setting a threshold.
The Museum of Tomorrow, in collaboration with Miami-Dade College's Magic program, proudly presents Amazonia, a virtual reality experience.
So if you see here, we were seeing that the level kind of ends up being in this range right here. So if we start moving our threshold down, what we're going to see is that we're going to get near that range.
The Museum of Tomorrow, in collaboration with Miami-Dade College's Magic program, proudly presents Amazonia.
Great, so let's leave it right about there in the negative 20 dB range. So it looks like as our narration is playing back, we're getting sort of in this range, maybe between negative 20 and up into the negative 12 or that kind of area, where that's sort of where the peaks of this narration are hitting on our level meter that we can see here. So I've set our threshold to this point because essentially what you're doing with threshold is setting the point at which compression will engage. Any audio, any signal that reaches above this threshold that we've set to -20 is going to trigger the compressor. Now, at this point, we are not actually triggering any compression. And why is that? That has to do with our ratio. So our ratio right now is set at 1:1. So nothing is going to be happening because for any audio that comes over the threshold, it comes in, say, 1 dB over the threshold, it's going to come out the same volume because this ratio is at a 1:1 ratio. Now let's say that we wanted to set this to a 2:1 ratio, and so we're right about there, 2.00 to 1. Now you can see here that this curve kind of moved down slightly, and what's happening there is that at this point where our threshold hits, at this -20, so before that ratio was set and we were over here at 1, you can see it's a straight line. Nothing changes once we hit that threshold. But as we raise our threshold and we're at that 2:1 range, or let's go even higher and go 5:1, we're going to see that, say, if we go up 5 decibels above that threshold, it's going to be decreased by that amount as well. So let's set our threshold. Let's actually go over here to a 3:1, more or less 3.01, close enough, 3:1 ratio. So you're going to see that as the audio comes up above, we're actually going to be attenuating it slightly. Let's play this back.
The Museum of Tomorrow, in collaboration with Miami-Dade College's Magic program, proudly presents Amazonia, a virtual reality experience.
So you can see here what's going on. This level meter here is showing you actually how much attenuation is happening in red. So as we exceed our threshold of -20, by however much we're exceeding at those different peaks, it's being reduced at a ratio of 3:1. For every 3 decibels, it's going down to 1. So let's see that again.
The Museum of Tomorrow, in collaboration with Miami-Dade College's Magic program, proudly presents.
So if we start to increase that threshold, you're going to see how our attenuation is going to, increase the ratio. Our attenuation is going to get larger, the amount of attenuation, because we are increasing the ratio and thus attenuating more audio above the threshold value.
The Museum of Tomorrow, in collaboration with Miami-Dade College's Magic program, proudly presents Amazonia, a virtual reality experience.
So this ratio is a huge ratio that I just went up as an example. And we're getting into the range at that point of this being more of a limiter than a compressor. And really, they're essentially the same thing, but a limiter just works at higher ratios. So essentially, it ends up working like a limit, where the threshold becomes a limit where you don't want any audio above that. But for right now, to work this as a compressor, we want to be in that lower range like we are now at, say, 4:1. So when we play this back, I want to show you what happens when you actually increase this threshold.
The Museum of Tomorrow, in collaboration with Miami-Dade College's Magic program, proudly presents Amazonia, a virtual reality experience.
So you can see that as I raised the threshold, there was a point where really very little, if any, peaks were exceeding that threshold. So the attenuation became much, much less, and we were really not affecting it. So as a result, you could hear how the volume increased because we were compressing it less. So the idea with compression is that if you are going to be attenuating this audio, and we're doing that right now to, for example, control these peaks and kind of squash the dynamic range of this audio. So if that's what we're doing, we are essentially lowering the overall volume of the audio. And that's where our makeup gain comes in. So really, the only way to see or hear rather the results of your compression that you're applying is by making sure that you're raising this makeup gain more or less to the amount that your maximum compression is happening. So let's see here what happens when we play this back.
The Museum of Tomorrow, in collaboration with Miami-Dade College's Magic program, proudly presents Amazonia, a virtual reality experience.
So you can see that I raised our makeup gain by about 10 decibels. And the reason I did that is because if you look at our attenuation, the most that I saw happening is sort of in that range, approaching 10 decibels. And it doesn't have to be exact. You want to use your ears and find sort of what a good level is coming in at. So that makeup gain is going to get our volume sort of close to the average volume that we were at before compressing, so that we're even able to see what's going on and how we're affecting the audio. You always want to try to get sort of an A-B comparison going of what you're doing, if possible. Now, some of these changes are going to be very subtle, but let's bypass and unbypass our audio so you can see what effects we're having. You're going to notice that because I capped off these peaks, essentially as if I were slicing off these peaks here, so that our audio, when we're raising the level with the makeup gain, if we're not kind of controlling the peaks, these peaks are going to end up here and possibly distorting. So essentially what you're doing with compression, and one of the more common uses, is that we're raising the overall volume of this material while controlling peaks so that they don't clip or distort, which would eventually happen if we raise this enough without capping off some of these peaks in the audio. And this can be much more evident, say, in an example where you have material like drums, where maybe there might be the softer sounds of a drum set, maybe some softer snare hits with brushes, as opposed to hitting the crash cymbal with a stick, where the crash cymbal is going to peak way up here and the brushes are going to be much softer. Now, if you raise the overall volume because you want those brushes louder, what's going to happen is you're probably going to end up with distortion happening in the crash cymbal hit. So let's check it out here with the file that we have loaded for narration. We'll do some bypassing and unbypassing. So let's hear our original audio.
The Museum of Tomorrow, in collaboration with Miami-Dade College's Magic program,
And unbypassed.
The Museum of Tomorrow, in collaboration with Miami-Dade College's Magic program, proudly presents Amazonia, a virtual reality experience.
So you can hear that it does sound better because we're hearing more of all the details in what the narrator is saying and all the subtle nuances of their words and everything that they're saying. But if you can carefully hear, what did we actually bring up in the process? We brought in some of the background noise because we did raise the overall level of the audio. So these are things you need to be aware of, and there are other ways that you would counteract this and control these kinds of things with noise gates or dialogue noise reduction, spectral noise reduction. And unfortunately, these are just side effects that we deal with when we are applying compression, where we are raising the overall volume of a signal. But it does sound better when the narrator is speaking. Now, one quick thing that could be done to get rid of some of that background noise you hear is what we've already done here in some places, where you're actually cutting some of that material out, as you can see.
The Museum of Tomorrow, in collaboration with
So in this case here,
Amazon.
all that space where that narrator is not speaking, and you're hearing that background noise come up, I'm going to get rid of that crossfade I've already added there. Actually, and what I'm going to do is actually just cut this audio, create a quick fade out and fade in, and let's hear that back.
Proudly presents Amazonia, a virtual reality.
So the result is that we get to hear the compressed audio and it sounds great, but we lose all that noise that's there. And actually, why not do the same thing over here in between this section of speech? Again, apply those short little fade in, fade out, and
Amazonia, a virtual reality.
perfect. So you hear how we get to have the effects of our compression
Amazonia.
happening. And there we're attenuating. We've got it at a 4:1 ratio. And what are we doing now, though? We cut out that background noise that we don't need.
Amazonia, a virtual reality experience.
Great. So now let's look at some of our other functions here in our compressor. We've got attack and release. So essentially what you're doing with your attack and release is setting how quickly this attenuation is happening. How quickly does this compression engage? So if we're actually trying to control peaks, which is what we're doing essentially right now with our narration, we're lowering, controlling these peaks that we see while bringing up the average volume of the overall signal using makeup gain. So we'd want our attack to be pretty short so that the compressor is engaging quick enough to catch those fast transients that make up these peaks in the audio, like what you're seeing here, for example. So a low attack, which right now it's at this default of what this plugin uses. Now, attack is often measured. It's a time measurement, the attack and release. How many milliseconds are before the compressor engages and disengages. But in this case, this plugin is just using their own unit of measurement that does correspond to a certain time measurement. So we're going to set this attack as low as we can possibly go because we really want those peaks to just be caught immediately.
The Museum of Tomorrow, in collaboration with Miami-Dade College.
Now, again, the release, you have the same kind of control, except it's how fast does the compression let go and go back to nominal volume. So we're going to leave that at the level that it is right now. And I'm going to show you in the attack, if we were to raise this attack, you're going to see how even though we're exceeding this threshold and our compression is trying to kick in, it's not going to kick in very quickly.
The Museum of Tomorrow.
In fact, it tries to kick in, but those peaks kind of happen so fast and leave so fast that it doesn't even give it time because we have such a long attack. So let's lower it a bit here.
The Museum of Tomorrow, in collaboration with Miami.
So as we lowered our attack, you see it starts to kick in a little more, but it's too long for the compressor to actually kick in because these peaks are happening very quickly. It's just the beginning of a word that's triggering it. So let's lower it here, 184.
The Museum of Tomorrow, in collaboration.
You can see that it's starting to kick in a little more. But again, when we lower this way down, it's an almost immediate kicking in of that compression.
The Museum of Tomorrow, in collaboration with Miami-Dade College.
So it's really capping down those peaks. So now let's take a look at what some other compressors look like. And they're all doing essentially the same thing, and you can achieve the same kinds of results, but they are going to look slightly different. Let's take a look at this one, which is a model of a classic compressor known as the 1176. And you can see here that you don't have that graphic that's showing you, how much the curve of the compressor is. And you're really just viewing it sort of as a representation of what the original hardware looked like on the 1176. Now, you do have your input and output. The output here could be used as a makeup gain, and your ratio we're actually setting just 4 to 1, 8 to 1, 12 to 1, 20 to 1, where we're basically turning it into a limiter. And we don't have a threshold control because essentially we're just setting the input, and there is a fixed threshold that you can look into the documentation and see what that is at. Now, again, for attack and release, it is its own unit of measurement, but it is time-based. But again, whatever, they have some unit here, 2 and 1 and 3, that corresponds to a specific unit of time that you would have to look into the documentation to find. And that's very common with a lot of different manufacturers. So you have your same here with the release, and here's your level meter that's going to show you what's going on with your compression. Now let's look at another plugin here, and this is the L3 Ultra Maximizer, and essentially this is working more as a limiter. And you can see here you do have a release setting, but it's not giving you an attack option. You do have a threshold and an out ceiling, and it shows you the attenuation, but it works in a different way than the compressor we saw, where we have the classic controls like threshold, ratio, makeup gain. But essentially, depending on where your threshold is, you are kind of working it the same way that you would a compressor, except the ratio on this is generally going to be pretty steep, pretty high, because it is meant to be a limiter rather than a compressor. Now, let's take a look here at another one. This is the L3LL, and what this is again, it is a working as a limiter, so we don't have control of ratio. We do have release control. We don't have an attack, because usually limiters work on pretty fast attacks. But the special thing about this compressor or compressor limiter here is that what we have are different bands, different frequency bands, where we can actually apply different amounts of compression or limiting depending on where the content, the audio content, is falling along the frequency range. So you have the same kind of graph as you would in an EQ, where you've got your decibels on the y-axis, how much we're boosting and cutting, and along here we've got frequency. For this is 16 hertz up to 16,000 hertz is marked here, so 20 would be at the very extreme. So essentially we can set up what these bands, how much compression is going to happen, and where these bands are going to separate. So here this band will be between 16 and 64, or somewhere in that lower range, and then 64 to 250. And for our narration, it's not going to make such a huge difference in these lower frequencies as we saw with frequency processing. But say in musical material, you are going to have material audio signal that is all spread out across a spectrum, and you are going to have that option of compressing it at different rates, or another, other than compressing and limiting, another thing you can do is actually expanding. When we go up here, that's where we start expanding. It's the same concept as compressing, that something's going to happen to the audio signal, to the dynamics past the threshold. But instead of attenuating, we're going to boost when it gets to that point. So those are a few of the different things that you can do with compressors, expanders, and limiters. Now, they are pretty complex pieces of machinery here, so they take a lot of experimentation to get used to, and I encourage you to really delve in and try to see what kinds of things your compressors do to your audio, so you get a good understanding of when and how you should use them in your audio production.